There's so many things in life that we can want, that we can try and achieve or get, become good at, change, essentially change towards. Um, that's really what's happening, is we're always changing and changing towards something. So we might not understand business, and we might say, oh, I'd really like to be able to understand business and finance. So we study, which is really a movement towards change. We start off not understanding business, and we have an intention to study, and that may lead to a change such that we understand business. And to what extent we understand and bits we don't understand is just a result of that change process. And we might say, well, I'd like to understand it fully. And at the end of the day, we understand it to whatever extent we understand it. We might want to understand it fully, and we might come out of the studies going, that really isn't for me. I have no idea what they're talking about. And so we can see you're not really in control of how well or not well you understand something. So you're not in control of the change process, but change happens. And you might want to become good at tennis. That's your objective. And so you practice, you go to lessons, you watch different players playing, and change happens, which means you may become better at tennis. So there's all sorts of things that we can focus on. And obviously, if we say we would like to, set up a vegetable patch in the garden, or do interior decorating, that requires our energy and our focus. And obviously, if you're interested in doing interior decorating and you want to get ideas and you want to learn about colors and what the current trends are, it's not much good reading about how to grow vegetables. So we really should ask ourselves, what is it that we're really interested in? If we don't ask this question, and let's say there are a lot of fields that are less defined than the ones I've described, less defined in the sense that they are less mainstream, there's more crossover. And so, if you're interested in interior decorating, you know that you're interested in interior decorating, and it wouldn't make sense to read a book on vegetables. However, there are some other things that we might be interested in that are much less or much more ephemeral and less defined than that. So when it comes to spiritual seeking, I think it's a very good question to ask. What is it that I'm really looking for? Or life in general. What is it that I'm really looking for? And the answer to that question is a very important question because it focuses us. It becomes the topic, the answer that we then move towards. And there's a trick, though, to answering this question: what is it that I'm really looking for? And the trick is that it turns out that a lot of spirituality is really trying to inform us that we're a bit confused about things in life. That's sort of what spiritual teaching starts off, or not even starts off, but is continually telling us that we're lost in illusion, that we've forgotten who we are, we don't know ourselves, we are looking for things in the wrong spot, we're looking for the wrong things. And given that this is what spiritual teachings tell us, I'd like to put out this sort of warning that when you ask yourself this question, what am I really looking for? Be wary of the answer that you get. Because if we just answer the question based on what we might think we're looking for, and then say, well, I've asked the question, I've got my answer, and now I'm going to put all my energy into that. It would be a shame if we didn't know what we were looking for. There's a Chinese proverb which I like a lot. It's quite an obscure one, but I think it's spot on. It's obscure, I not use that much. So be careful what you look for. Well, I'll start again. Be careful what you wish for. You might just get it. And what it's implying is that we might think we want something. We might wish for it. Like, oh, that's all I want, God. Just that thing. And then we get it. And we might be so wrong, i.e. in wishing for or thinking what it is that's important. We might be so wrong, and when we get it, it might really be dissatisfying to the extent, not that it's not satisfying and just neutral, but actually very much not what we want. Be careful what you wish for. You might just get it. It's really saying exactly that. Be careful what you wish for. In other words, be sure what you're looking for. So another thing spiritual teachings, and this teaching in particular, will warn you about is to not believe things. Because belief is a type of thinking that is prone to not see truth, not see things as it really is. And belief is a thinking modality that is sort of is very common, and it's common because of the way that we develop. So we're forced really to believe things because we haven't necessarily seen how easy it is to believe something and how misguided it can be if we believe things, especially the wrong things. So spiritual teachings will point out that belief is not an adequate way of approaching an investigation into life. It's actually what's at the core of our misunderstanding, the principle of belief. It's not so much what we believe. That too is a problem. The content of the belief is a problem. But it's not saying, oh, well, it's just because what you believe is wrong. It's the very principle of belief that is wrong or problematic. And why is it problematic? In principle, it's problematic because belief is a relationship, a thinking relationship to something that is changing, relative. Relative is the word. Relative means it isn't absolute. It is changing, is a feature of relative, and something that is absolute or true doesn't change. That's a feature of the absolute. So a belief is a relationship to a concept. A concept describes for example, who are you? And you might have an answer. I am, a human being, for example. Now, we might think that's not a problem to believe I'm a human being. But what if that's not really correct? Then that belief is a problem. So, do I believe I'm a human being? My answer is I don't feel that I have any beliefs because of the principle of belief being seen to be false. But I do have lots of concepts. So I'm happy with the concept, I'm a human being, but I won't hold it absolutely. Meaning I understand that it is the correct answer or a correct answer from a certain perspective. And from another perspective, even another perspective from within the daily life experience, the answer, yes, I am a human being, or the belief, yes, I'm a human being, and belief doesn't tend to allow for anything else. It makes the situation absolute. And so all concepts are describing something from a certain perspective, from a certain point of view. So they are correct or incorrect from that point of view. And if we think that it describes something absolutely, we've mistaken the nature of concept. And belief is this attitude towards a concept, a label, a description, a notion, a description of something relative to other things, maybe. Even just the apple is red is a concept. I am good, I am bad, they are concepts. And so if we hold that absolutely, so we might have performed poorly in a certain task, and so we might say, I wasn't very good at that task, or I'm not very good at art. Now, if we take that and make it absolute, we may never try art again. We may think that it means I'm not a good person because we've taken it too absolutely. So the clearer we become on concepts, and the clearer we can be that the concept is a description of something, and something very specific, and not let it bleed over into describing something that it's not. Anyway, let's get back onto the fact that a concept is a relative description of something, and if we take it, a concept which is relative, and turn it into an absolute in our head, meaning that's the relationship we have to certain concepts, then that in principle is an error, because it's relating to something that is relative as if it is absolute. And people by default, as I said, tend to believe things, and so we have concepts like the earth is flat that at some points in time we realize, oh, that is wrong. And someone would say, well, that is fundamentally absolutely wrong. Now, the truth is that in practice, the earth is flat, even though in theory, or we might say actually, from a perspective of the earth in relation to other planets, or it's spherical or round, spherical. We can also say, actually, in practice, the earth is flat. However, going back 300 years, humanity was convinced that the earth was a flat plane and nothing to do with spherical. And so we can see how concepts can be completely wrong. Relatively, we could say it's still right in terms of practically speaking. And so this is how we have to start relating to our thinking, that it's relative, that it only has certain information, and certain conclusions that we form are based on the information we have. And as the information changes, as our way of looking at the information changes, then our conclusion might change. And so we might say, that I'm a liberalist or a nationalist or a Republican or a Democrat, and we might hold that absolutely, and we find in 10 years' time we may never have thought we would switch parties, and then we do, and we realize, oh, I need to hold these concepts more loosely. So I don't believe I'm a human being. I don't believe anything. For me, the notion of belief is problematic. Now, that doesn't mean that I won't say, oh yes, I believe this, because that's just a figure of speech. But I know inside, when I say something, there's always a question of doubt as to whether I've processed the information wrong. I only have a limited amount of information. And so this principle is very important. So anyway, spiritual teachings tell us belief is a problem. And what tends to happen is we believe information we're given that can be broad, quite a broad statement, and we then don't think about that concept that we have been given, and we don't investigate it for ourselves. we just say, so-and-so told me, so that's how it is. What we need to do is we need to take the information and investigate it for ourselves. Now, in some situations, we don't have the capacity to investigate it for ourselves. Let's say when it comes to very complicated physics formulas or whatever. And so if someone who is an expert in their field gives us the concept, then I'd say, well, he's an expert in the field. I'm not. I can't confirm it. So if other people are taking it to be correct and they have tested it, let's say, then I'll say I'll relate to it as if it is correct, but it's not absolute, because even an expert isn't going to be able to come up with an absolute, because still they have a relative brain that has only relative information, limited information. It can process things incorrectly, it can miss things out. And so once again, we know how to hold the concept. But ideally, we need to investigate, especially if they are concepts that we can investigate, and say, yes, I understand why I'm holding that concept as being relevant, rather than me saying, well, I just I don't understand it, or I don't agree with the methodology or the reasoning. So if we can investigate a concept for ourselves, it changes from being just something that someone else has worked out to something that we have inquired into, we've asked on what basis they've come to these conclusions, and then we've investigated whether the statements and the basis and the rationale make sense. And so when it comes to this spiritual teaching, it says, okay, ask yourself this very important question. What is it that you're really looking for? Ask yourself that question in practical terms. In practical terms, what am I really looking for? Why do we ask this in practical terms? Because it's very easy to come up with some esoteric notion that is not practical, which means it's hard for us to investigate it. And it's hard for us to know whether we're really looking for it. Whereas if we say in practical terms what I'm looking for, we can understand why we're looking for that. So what that means is that if we just say, oh, I'm looking for union with God or enlightenment, these are not really practical. It's like, why are you looking for that? And we say, well, because I read in the book that that's the primary purpose of life, or that's the highest mission you can have. And so you're looking for something, but it's not based on a practical reason. So we haven't boiled what I'm really looking for down into practical terms. So we could, what this means in practical terms, it's like, I'm looking for water because I'm thirsty. So that's a practical answer. I'm looking for a house that has sufficient sun in summer and winter so that I can grow my own vegetables. That's practical. And so in this quest, we say, in practical terms, what are you looking for? And why do we say this? Because in the case of answering this question, we can be practical. We need to be practical. If we are practical, we'll come up with an answer that we really say, I know why I've come up with this answer, because it's very practical, and practical is good when it can be, when it's relevant. So don't believe what you're told. Inquire into it. Use it as a guide. Use it as a pointer. So if someone says this is the most important thing, don't believe that, but don't throw it out. You go, oh, he says it's the most important thing. She says it's the most important thing. I wonder why they're saying it's the most important thing. Let me listen to their explanation, and then let me inquire whether it's the most important thing for me, because remember, concepts are relative. So it might be it's the most important thing for him or her, but it's not going to be the most important thing for me. Now, I suggest that for all intents and purposes, if someone is spiritually seeking or on a spiritual seeking quest, then this answer is still relative, but it's much more universal than some other things. Like, broccoli is the best vegetable, is, I would say, much more subjective. And so someone else will say, well, actually, I really don't like broccoli and I like tomatoes. The answer to spiritual seeking, whether we realize it or not, is much more universal. So this notion that we're all different, and so what's important for them is not important for me, is a valid way of looking at some things in relation to individuals. But in relation to what we're really looking for, I'd suggest the answer is quite universal. So we don't want to believe people. So when I give the answer, okay, let me not beat around the bush anymore. You've all heard it before. The answer to that question, as suggested in the teaching, is what we're really looking for, whether we realize it or not. And remember, we tend to be focused on the wrong things. We tend to have a misunderstanding about life. So we may well not realize this. We may argue against it. It may not seem like what we're really looking for. What we're really looking for, according to this teaching, as a pointer, is happiness for this human being in this life. And happiness is definitely not the happiness that is normally inferred by the word happiness. So you might say, well, why do we use the word happiness? There's a reason for it, because once all the stuff has fallen away, we realize that this is happiness, what we end up having access to. We would say that's happiness. That is happiness for the human being. Now, the thing is that the way the word happiness has been generally used is to mean something else, because the belief is that happiness is something else, and it just isn't to be found there. It isn't to be found in pleasurable feelings, in circumstance being exactly how we want it. And usually the word happy is the opposite of sad. And so we think, well, if I'm sad, I can't be happy. And happy, therefore, means things are good, I'm on holiday, I'm getting things done well at work and being rewarded for my work, I'm seeing people that I enjoy. So I'm happy, I'm excited, I'm feeling good. That's not the happiness that is being spoken about. That happiness is going to be temporary, it's going to come and go, and it's very much dependent on circumstance. If we're happy, it's because things are going well, and we know that in life it rains on days that you don't want it to rain. We get sick when we would prefer not to be sick. We lose money when we would prefer to make money. And life is interconnected opposites, and so at other times the opposites of those things happen. We feel great, people help us out, we get bonuses that we didn't expect, and the weather is fantastic on the days we want it to be fantastic. It's a mix. Life is a mix, sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain, and that applies for our own life experience. Some days it's pleasurable, sometimes it's painful. Some hours are pleasurable, some hours are painful. Some minutes are pleasurable and painful. Some seconds are pleasurable and painful. So it doesn't have to be, one whole day is pleasurable, one whole day is painful. This is pretty straightforward stuff. And when we get into the experience of life, we might start to realize that there are several different pleasures and pains that can be possible at a particular point in time. So we might be having a great conversation with someone that's pleasurable, but the sun might be shining on us and it's getting too hot, and that's not our preference, so a form of pain. And there might be lots of noise at the same time as we're talking to our friend, and so that's also a bit of a downside. So we can see that in a particular situation there are several different pleasures and pains, and if we put them all together, like the moment is all together, you could say overall it was more pleasurable than painful, or more painful than pleasurable. Anyhow, the flow of life, which means the circumstance of life, and circumstance means outcomes in each moment, and circumstance, outcomes, flow of life is either pleasure or pain. It's pleasurable if the circumstance is in line with your biological preferences. It's painful if the circumstance is not in line with your biological preferences. And you're not in control of the circumstance you find yourself in, and you're not in control of your particular makeup, which is a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning. So that is, up-to-date conditioning is the cumulative effect of the new conditioning that life delivers moment after moment after moment. And that new conditioning is delivered by the circumstance you find yourself in, what your parents are telling you, what you're reading, what society is telling you, what experience contributes. Your own thoughts are part of your new conditioning coming in as a feedback, as part of a feedback loop. So when you think about something in a new way, that insight or that realization or that understanding, you can say, is new conditioning. So you have changed in that moment. And so we are a result in each moment of our genes and up-to-date conditioning. And the up-to-date conditioning is the cumulative effect of all of the new conditioning from the time we came into existence up to this point in time. And included in our genes and up-to-date conditioning are our biological preferences. And our biological preferences are what the human being interacts with the circumstance. And if the circumstance is in line with our preferences, then we can call it pleasurable. If it's not in line with our preferences, it's painful. So these are all concepts. These are descriptions of life. And they're descriptions of life that are particularly useful to this topic of happiness for the human being in this life. I would rarely put any concepts in if I didn't feel they were not relevant to the topic of happiness in daily living. So if there's a concept that you hear, and there's literally hundreds of concepts. I talk for 2 hours and everything anyone says is a concept. Anything anyone has ever written down is a concept. So the talk, you see, that was a concept. That says, whenever anyone says anything, that's a concept. Anything that has been written down is a concept. That itself, that description is a concept. So I'm always putting forward concepts. Now, the concepts are relative to, i.e. meaning the point of the talks is happiness in daily living. So if I put forward a concept and someone says, oh, that's not right, understand that the concepts are not meant to be technically perfect in relation to any topic. So if I talk about the human being as a result of genes and up-to-date conditioning in a medical setting, we might find that the word genes refers to some very particular part of the human body. That's quite clear that we have, let's say, in a medical setting, that you might be able to isolate genes out as opposed to some other component. Now, clearly in the context of these talks, when we say we are a result of our genes and up-to-date conditioning, what it means is that the genetic structure is what turns into the human biological structure. So in this context, genes means the blueprint that turns into, that grows automatically as part of being in life into this. And that hardware is conditioned by circumstance. So the hardware doesn't exist separate from the circumstance. If the hardware was separate from the circumstance, it simply wouldn't be conditioned by the circumstance. So the fact that the hardware is conditioned by the circumstance shows us that the hardware, meaning the biological instrument, is not separate from the circumstance. Now remember, in spiritual teachings, we're often reminded that the problem is the problem of separation. That freedom comes from a realization that we have never been separate. And so coming to see our non-separateness, meaning if the veil is pulled away from our separateness, then separation ends. Now, we often think that separation is an experience because we experience ourselves separately. We experience ourselves separate from the book or the table or the tree. And so we're often thinking that the end of separation means the end of the sense of being separate as an experience. And that's very understandable that we would conclude that. And what tends to compound that belief, that way of interpreting the concept, is that we are told that the shifts are experiential and not just intellectual. The understanding can't be just an intellectual understanding. The understanding is experiential. Now, what I believe that means in the truest sense, or in a broader sense, doesn't mean that it's experiential such that the experience of separation falls away and remains fallen away forever. What I believe, oh, I won't use that word, my interpretation of that concept based on my experience and how I use the concepts of the end of separation is that in order for the end of separation, which in large part is what I would call a psychological separation, in order for that psychological separation to fall away, the understanding, which can start off as an intellectual understanding, needs to go deeper and deeper and deeper. And deeper and deeper and deeper mean beyond the superficial understanding of something in theory. So the concept is delivered in pretty straightforward everyday English, and after delivering it, I could say to someone, do you understand the concept? And they say, I heard what you said, and I understand what your point is. So that means that they have understood it intellectually. The alternative is I say, okay, that was the concept. So for example, we have a deeply ingrained belief of personal doership. That means we believe that we are the doers of everything that happens through us. Now, the conceptual framework says we're not the doers. This attitude of personal doership, which means seeing ourselves as a separate, independent entity that does everything and is in control of what they do. So this idea of agency, it's that attitude of personal doership is misguided. And the reason that it's misguided is that, more accurately, the way the human being functions is a result of their very complex design, which they have in each moment, and in each moment it's different. It's always, the design is always changing. But what we are is a result of the design. So in each moment, I'm a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning, and I can't possibly function any differently because there is a circumstance that the biological instrument processes, and based on its exact makeup, it's processed the situation a particular way, and an action has happened, or a thought has happened, or an emotion has happened, or some words have happened. And the attitude of personal doership doesn't recognize the actual dynamics that make a thought happen, make an action happen, a behavior or a speech or an emotion. They don't appreciate the actual dynamics, which are very impersonal. They are impersonal causality that the individual wasn't in control of. Doesn't appreciate that and just assumes that the speaking is a result of a fictitious me that is the controller. So if I say, so does that make sense to you? If I say that to someone, they can say, well, I heard what you said and I understand. I understand that you're saying there is a attitude that is applied to what happens in life by the person. And that attitude is taking everything personally, saying it is my doing, and seeing the other do things, and therefore we say they are the doer of their actions. So I go, that's exactly right. And so the person says, I understand what you're saying intellectually, but I can't say that I am on board with it yet. I'll have to give it some more thought. I'll have to investigate it. Do you have anything more you'd like to say about it so that I can investigate it and I'll come back to you? I say, well, let's be clear that the human being in each moment is based on their genes and up-to-date conditioning, and genes refers to the blueprint that comes into existence when the sperm and the egg come together, and clearly that blueprint grows, and no human is in control of that growing. Even the mother that is carrying the child is not consciously controlling the thing. It's her biological functioning that is the environment in which that blueprint is growing. So that's the genes, and from the time of conception, the entity, the biological entity, the physical hardware is being impacted by circumstance. So if the mother is playing soothing music, it's said to have an effect, it seems, based on some research that shows an effect. And that is new conditioning that the genetic structure with its previous conditioning, whatever the conditioning it received previously, so in its state in that moment is receiving new conditioning that is going to impact it one way or another. And that the structure that we are in each moment is not in our control. So, and the person says, fair enough, I understand what you're saying intellectually. So now that intellectual understanding is not sufficient to dissolve the psychological attitude of separation. Why? Because the attitude of separation has been put in place as a cumulative part of our growth from a very young age. It's part of how the sense of self develops, and it's based on how life is experienced. To be frank, it's not a surprise that I am the doer belief gets deeply ingrained, because from a young age, maybe not as a newly born infant, from my observation of a newly born infant, they seem quite unaware of their own hand being part of what they are. And I suspect that's because the sensory input is being received by and processed by the brain in a way that hasn't formed certain links to make it feel like this is me. And after a certain amount of growth, a certain amount of experience, which includes repetitive visual, sight, sound, tactile experience, the sense of, oh, this particular body seems to give different feedback than when that body touches things. And so the brain then forms, it says, oh, this is who I am. And the movements tend to happen in line with, often with conscious thoughts. And so there does seem like there is agency control over what happens. So to me, it's not at all surprising that the belief I am the doer of my words gets put in place. And so a description that says you're not the doer is unlikely to shatter that psychological me, the psychological doer, that has been put in place as an assumption, as a sense of self, that I'm suggesting is inaccurate, but understandable. Understandable because the surface experience suggests we're the doer, and so I can't expect any other psychological identity to have formed, given the experience is a certain way. And so it's deeply ingrained. And so being told that life is different is unlikely to just shatter that. If, however, we find ourselves with a motivation, with an interest, with a resonance in that concept, where we think, this is extraordinary. Could it be that I'm not the doer? Could it be that we don't have free will in the sense that is taken for granted and assumed based on the way it feels that we do have free will? So if someone finds themselves having heard these concepts or read anything in a book that is not mainstream and then finds a resonance with it and says, I'm interested in this, I want to know if this is true, tell me more. And there's the listening, and then there is thinking about it happens over the next day and the next week and the next year. Then that thinking and observing, this is where it's very important. The thinking needs to translate into an inquiry for oneself. And that then has the effect of potentially undoing or breaking the psychological identity that has been put in place. And that can happen, especially if someone is involved or immersed in this teaching, because all teachings take a slightly different approach to the topic. In this teaching, the collapse or a large shake-up of the psychological me can be that in a moment, after having thought about this for weeks and months, we might be doing something outside and maybe a movement, a fly lands on your head and there's a shooing away of the fly or trying to kill the fly. That might happen automatically. And in that moment, there could be an insight that says, I simply cannot be the doer. Now, that's not, that would be what is referred to in some teachings, I don't use the word very much, but as grace. Why is it grace? Because we didn't do it in the sense there's a very clear, when we have these insights, there's a very clear sense that it's like the universe has conspired in that moment for that thought to arise. And if anything was different, it feels like it might not have, that realization might not have been there. So the circumstance essentially supports the realization, and it doesn't feel like it's linked to anything else. It just seems like oh, this is grace. The information has been delivered to me from God. The truth is, it's probably a culmination of all of the inquiry that has been happening. You might have been thinking for weeks about non-doership and inquiring about, well, just because I am based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning, how does that mean that I'm not the doer? Isn't there place for some choice that is my choice that makes me in control? And so we might say, well, I chose to go to university. I didn't want to go to university because no one in my family went to university, and everyone was saying how it's much better to get out there and start working, and you can set up a career without going to university. My grandfather did it, my father did it, my uncles did it. And so I didn't go to university, and I was following in their footsteps. And then at a certain point in time, I thought, no, I'm going to go to university. So we might say, see, that was my choice. So I'm not sure my genes and up-to-date conditioning, there's also this factor of my choice to go to university. And you might be thinking about it, and then you think, but actually my choice to go to university was because in that moment I was looking at my uncles working, and I said, well, I don't necessarily want to do what my uncles and my father and my grandfather did. And so I'm going to choose to go to university. That's what I really want. And so in that moment I made a choice, and then we might realize, oh, well, that was a result of my genes, and the circumstance that I found myself in, the circumstance I grew up in. And more particularly in that moment, I saw my uncles, or I visualized my uncles and my father and my grandfather. And so that was my up-to-date conditioning. If I hadn't had those uncles and grandfather and father doing that job, that wouldn't be part of my up-to-date conditioning. The fact is that every day my father came home from work, that was new conditioning to my system. So the choice that we are sure is my choice is exactly what is being pointed at by everything that happens through us in each moment is a result of our genes and up-to-date conditioning. So the person who's investigating, inquiring, contemplating these concepts may have an insight about, oh, even my choices, which I'm sure were my choices, and I was referring to my free will where I chose to go to university, was also a result. It was a choice, it was a decision, but I see that choice simply means picking one of several options that are available. And choice and picking an option doesn't require an agent or a doer. All it requires is a biological instrument that is designed to pick between choices. So you can have a computer that is programmed to pick certain choices. And when it picks, that is a decision. It is a choice. It has three options, and it's being programmed to always pick red, or to stop on red and go on green. So it makes choices. It is picking an option. And that doesn't mean that there is free will. It just means that there is a biological instrument designed to stop on red and go on green. And so if we're investigating this, we might have a click, oh, I see. But it might not lead to the moment I'm talking about. That insight might not be, I simply cannot be the doer. It's like, oh, I get it. Even that component is not me, but part of, and so we carry on our stuff, carry on doing whatever happens next. And then at some point, this fly might land and the hand goes up. And in that moment, having had the previous contemplations and insights, in that moment, we might laugh. I simply cannot be the doer. And that is a significant shake-up of the psychological me that believes it is the doer. The previous realization, the previous understanding that even a choice that I was convinced was my little bit of free will in life, seeing that the choice was also a result of genes and up-to-date conditioning, meaning understanding the concept, because sometimes we can hear the concept saying genes and up-to-date conditioning, and then choices, we wonder, well, that's separate, until it gets brought into the fold of genes and up-to-date conditioning. And so that's very significant as well. That moment of realization was significant. And so the cumulative effect of all of that at some point, is shaking up the identity of doership. It's weakening it. And at some point, we might have this flash of insight. I simply cannot be the doer. And that flash of insight is deep. It's not just, oh yeah, Roger said we're not the doer. And he gave me some explanation. I can't remember what it was. Sounded good enough at the time. So I'm running with, I'm not the doer. No, that's no good. That's an intellectual understanding at best. And in fact, it's not even an intellectual understanding, because in that description, the person says, I can't even remember what the explanation was. So he might have had an intellectual understanding 3 weeks ago when it was described, because at that time he goes, yeah, that makes sense. I get it. Yep. But then it didn't go any deeper. In fact, it did the opposite of go deeper. It went from being an intellectual understanding to, oh, he said something, it sounded good at the time, and I'm running with it. So that's just not going to cut it. It's not going to break the deeply ingrained belief of personal doership. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not telling someone you have to be dedicated, you have to go deeper and deeper and deeper. That's not something that we do. We're not the doer. It's something that happens in life if it's destined to happen. And it's destined to happen for people if they find a motivation. So there's plenty of people that would have turned on these talks, listened, and gone, oh, he talks too much, or it's too intellectual, or I'm not interested in hearing someone tell me that I'm not the doer. I actually want to know how to get more. There's all sorts of different people that would have heard the message, and many of them would have said, not for me. They might not even have said not for me, just wouldn't have landed. And then there's other people that listen and go, this is important. And then there's, out of the ones listening, it's important, there's some that are going, I really want, I'm dedicated, I want to, and it just doesn't seem to go any deeper. And then there are others that find themselves interested, and it just goes deeper and deeper and deeper. And that's just destiny unfolding. We're not the ones in control of whether it's completely not interesting to us, whether it's interesting but it only goes so deep, or whether it's interesting and it keeps going deeper and deeper. And for some people, they're not interested, and yet it still goes deeper and deeper. They say, I can't get it out of my head. I wasn't interested, but he said something and it just sticks in my head. And then that might snowball into something, which at that point means there will be an interest. If the thinking continues, you'd have to say at some level there is an interest. Everything is a happening according to God's will. Life is a happening. Let life flow. To see thinking as a happening. Thinking arises in a body-mind organism. Emotions arise in a body-mind organism. Biological reactions arise. So talking is a biological reaction. Biological reactions arise in a body-mind organism. Emotions are either a biological or psychological reaction, depending on the type of emotion. So in general terms, we can say biological reactions arise in the body-mind organism, psychological reactions arise in the body-mind organism. Or we can break it down. Thoughts arise in a body-mind organism, emotions arise in a body-mind organism, feelings arise in a body-mind organism, actions happen through a body-mind organism. So life is a happening. to see these movements as a happening is very significant. It means that the identification as the doer is falling away. So it's very clear that we don't make our heart beat. The heart beating is happening, breathing is happening. The processing that the liver does is happening. Thinking is happening. So certain functions that are automatic are very clearly automatic because we have no conscious attention placed on them, and they just keep happening. There are other functions that of the body that seem like there is a conscious controller of them because they happen less automatically. It's like going to the fridge and opening the fridge is preceded by a thought. And so the thought seems like I created the thought. And so then the actions that follow seem like, well, that wasn't just a happening, that was my doing after I thought I would like to do that. So there are some functions in the body that are very clearly not my doing, and yet there's a whole range of functions that feel like my doing. And they feel like my doing or are interpreted as my doing because we don't appreciate the thoughts, which often tend to be what seem like the starting point of my actions and my functioning. Often it's a thought that starts the process of your behavior or your actions. And we assume that I am the thinker, that thought is my thought. Not only my thought, but I am that. I am the thought. I am the thinker and therefore the thought. And that's where the psychological me doer starts, in that era. So if we can start to see that thinking is a result of the biological instrument, primarily the very complex brain. Whether that's true or not is not the point. It seems like we have a brain. For all intents and purposes, we have a brain. And it's for the purpose of these talks, it's fair to say that thoughts come from a brain as one of the models. I could also say thoughts come out of nowhere, which is also true from a certain perspective. If we're just aware in meditation, uninvolved, we can see that a thought wasn't there and then it pops into existence and then it fades away. And so if someone said that thought comes from a brain, we might say, well, actually, that's just a belief that the thought comes from a brain. It may not. As far as my experience goes, the thought just appears out of nowhere. So either one, whether you say the thought appears out of nowhere or the thought appears out of the brain, the conclusion we can come from is it happens. And it happens either from a very complex biological instrument, which is the brain, which is a result of the genes and the up-to-date conditioning that has happened through our whole life. And then that brain, a bit like a computer, functions a certain way. And we're so used to saying, that's me functioning. Whereas it's a biological instrument functioning, the brain functioning, and brain spits out thoughts like cookies out of a cookie machine. And the cookies come out of the cookie machine not by accident, but because it's designed to do that. And so if the cookies start coming out, strange shape, we know something's changed in the machine. The pattern cutter is broken, or the dough roller isn't working properly, or whatever. And so the cookies come out looking like they should or not looking like they should, because of the design of the machine in that moment, or the structure of the machine in that moment. And the human being is like that. It's spitting out all sorts of functions. And as I said, from a young age, we have assumed that that is me, and that assumption is me, the doer. I am doing that. And that's the psychological identity that forms. And so this explanation that I've been going through today is an explanation of how we can start to see life, which I say is seeing life at a deeper level, because we're talking about dynamics that are unnoticed, dynamics that we don't need to understand in order for the functioning to happen. But if we don't understand them, the belief in personal doership error gets put in place and doesn't change. So why is this important, this belief in personal doership? It's important because what we're really looking for, whether we realize it or not, this is the suggested answer to that question, the very important question, because you're going to spend years or at least months of your life putting a lot of attention into what arguably is the most precious project you could devote yourself to. So you might as well get the answer to the question, right? You might as well be clear. You need to ask the question, what am I really looking for? What we're really looking for, whether we understand it or not, is happiness in this life, and happiness is peace of mind. So we're really looking for peace of mind. And peace of mind is not the gaining of something, and it's not really peace just on the level of mind, because mind penetrates to our whole experience. So peace of mind means an experience of the absence of suffering. Now, what does the absence of suffering? The presence of suffering means suffering. The absence of suffering is the opposite of the presence of suffering. So, no suffering. Peace of mind is when suffering is not there. Now, suffering can take on many different forms, some of which are sort of like a blanket and can be quite mild and can become normalized. So it might seem like we're not suffering, and so then we might say, oh, this is peace of mind because I'm not suffering, where in fact we are suffering. And so if we're not registering the suffering, doesn't mean it's not having an effect. And so if there is a blanket layer of suffering that is quite mild, or even a suffering that arises intermittently and it's quite mild and we've sort of normalized it, we won't know what peace of mind is. We might say, oh, well, if that's the case, there's nothing special about this. Whereas what we're really assessing is a blanket, mild, normalized state of suffering. Now, mind you, when that's not there, it's not to say that peace of mind is going to blow your mind, because peace of mind is definitely not ecstasy or bliss. It gets seen to be precious when one remembers, knows the experience of suffering. And when suffering is intense enough, or we've become familiar enough with it in its mild form to feel what effect it has on what you could describe as a truer experience. It's not really true, because that makes it, well, for various reasons in teachings, valid reasons, it can point to your true self, your true nature. And the doership belief and the suffering is referred to as your false sense of self. And the reason it's a false sense of self, or described as a false sense of self, is because the interpretation of yourself as being the doer is essentially a misguided interpretation of how life happens. So then that means if the sense of self is I, am the doer and I need pleasure, pleasure, pleasure in order to be complete, we can say, well, that's a psychological identity that is formed. It is creating a certain experience of life, inherently an uncomfortable experience of life. And so we can call that the false sense of self. And when that falls away, what is revealed is another sense of self. But that sense of self feels much emptier because it is the absence of a certain belief structure. Emptier in a way that is precious, empty as in free from the clutter of this uncomfortable thinking. So there is, often it's referred to as silence, emptiness, spaciousness, all of which because it is the absence of the thinking mind. And the thinking mind translates to a sense of who we are that is an uncomfortableness. And its contraction is another quality of the small or the false sense of self. So contracted because it feels very separate, it feels very threatened, it's fearful of what the other can do to it because it believes that its completeness, its happiness is to be found in outcomes and the other can take outcomes away. So it sees the other as a threat, as an enemy, a competitor, a rival. And so this contraction happens. We feel contracted because we are resisting so much of what happens in the flow of life. And as that psychological identity falls away, the narrative that is blame and guilt and shame and pride, expectation, worry, that narrative falls away. The contraction tends to fall away and there's more space and silence and stillness. And that's the space of the mind, the stillness of the mind, the silence of the mind, that translates to the whole experience. So it's not an intellectual understanding. It's not an intellectual piece. It is a palpable absence of suffering, which is a mental movement, a psychological movement, and that psychological movement infects, you could say, the whole experience of life on an experiential level. And it creates an uncomfortableness that weaves its way through the tapestry of life. So, rounding off for today's talks before we get to some questions, I was talking about separation and how it's not necessarily an experiential end of separation in the sense of feeling oneself to no longer be the body, for example, or a person, or this identity. Not identity, this entity, this instrument. And what compounds that notion that liberation is the end of separation in an experiential sense and meaning an experiential oneness, is that there are peak experiences that happen. And when I say peak experiences, they can actually be experiences that become quite stabilized. And there is a sense that what we are is not the body, what we are is formless awareness that is aware of all of life that is happening, and it's aware of life as a, let's say, well, as an experience, meaning what used to be taken to be form and absolutely form is now seen to be an appearance that is experienced as form. And in that state of knowing everything from the witnessing awareness, there is a sense of oneness where the living as the body tends to fall away. And so when those peak experiences happen, and happen in a way that they can remain quite stabilized and ongoing, it's no doubt or no surprise that it's assumed to be that which is spoken about when it said, this is not an intellectual understanding, but rather it is an experiential knowing. And so we can often think that that's what we're looking for, that we're looking for a oneness experience. Because in that oneness experience, suffering is generally not there. Although, because that's not the stabilized and integrated state, my assertion is that someone who finds themselves in that stabilized state says they're in a stabilized state because they're often in that state. However, there's likely to be a lot of flip-flopping in that phase, because a whole range of dynamics in life haven't been seen clearly, because what has been the focus of that, the teaching that brings that about, tends to be a top-down teaching that focuses on you are awareness, you are not the body. All of the experience of life is not real, it's an illusion, which is very valid. It's a different path, and I'm pointing out one of the components that I think can become a sticking point there. And that is this notion that the end of separation means a oneness experience, means the end of separation on an experiential level where everything turns into experiential oneness. Now, imagine if, going back to what I was talking about, how the understanding has to go deeper and deeper and deeper, it goes deeper and deeper and deeper until it dissolves the belief of personal doership. And we then know ourselves beyond the intellect, what we can call as a knowing, because we feel that what is happening is a happening through a body-mind organism. So the thinking is seen to be a happening, is and can't be mistaken for anything other than a happening, an impersonal happening and not my doing. And if it can't be mistaken for anything other than a happening, same with the actions and the emotions and the feelings, then that means that the old attitude of personal doership has dissolved. And with it, the identity, which was the attitude of personal doership, the psychological me, dissolved. And that changes on an experiential level. Because I mentioned that the psychological self, even though we can refer to it as being a psychological or mental movement, translates into an experiential sense of uncomfortableness. So as that dissolves, and we no longer see ourselves as the doer, we no longer see ourselves as separate from life. It becomes clear that life is moving through us, and that we are instruments of life. The human being is an instrument through which life is functioning, through which consciousness is functioning. And so then we come to know ourselves as a conscious biological instrument, or rather a biological instrument through which consciousness is functioning. And we know that all of these things are happening and not my doing, because the body is not separate from life. Life is continually conditioning it. So it's known that the body is actually emerging from life. It's an extrusion out of life. We can look at the sperm and the egg coming together and the organism growing. It's sort of like it's being pushed out of life into form, and then it's being continually impacted by life, which means I am intrinsically one with all of life. I am part of life. I am an expression of life, and the other is an expression of life. And so that is the end of the psychological separation, where we are now, we're all in this together. We're not enemies, competitors, rivals, but we're universal brothers and sisters through which life is functioning. all instruments through which God's will is unfolding. So with this new perspective, if the other delivers an outcome that is painful to you, it's now seen as one's destiny. It was the destiny of the other to deliver the pain. Whereas previously, when we saw the other as a separate, independent doer, it was someone who is my competitor, my rival, my enemy, is delivering pain to me, and therefore I hate you. Because we also believed that pain was an attack on who I am, because pain was seen to be the opposite of what I thought happiness was. I thought happiness was pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. So when the other delivers a painful circumstance or a painful outcome, then it's seen to be an attack on my happiness, which is an attack on who I am, because we're looking for happiness, but we were just looking for it in the wrong place. And so that seems like the other is an enemy, because he's interfering with what I'm looking for, what I'm really looking for, happiness. And we just had the wrong idea of happiness. We thought it was to be found in pleasure. And so now the psychological separation has fallen away. And it's not just intellectual, it's experiential. Like, I can't possibly see the other as anything other than an instrument through which life is functioning, because I know myself as an instrument through which life is functioning. I simply cannot be the doer. So that means when anger arises, it's not pleasant, but it's not my doing. It's a result of the genes and up-to-date conditioning and the circumstance I find myself in. Now, that's not an excuse. That's not something that is going to prevent anger from feeling painful. It's not going to prevent anger from being received by the other as pain, because it is. If I was being pleasant or joyful, then that's going to be received by the other differently to anger. So it doesn't stop seeing myself as not the doer. It doesn't stop the anger being painful to myself and to the other, and for the other, therefore, there being a consequence to the anger. And that consequence might be anger back at me, which is more pain to me. So seeing myself as not the doer doesn't absolve me from the pain of the anger or from the consequence of society. So if I were to steal something and recognize it as not my doing, as a happening according to God's will even. Now, if someone hears that, they go, that's a very convenient excuse. Right? Now, what if it's true? That's why I sit here each day. I say, this is the principle. The principle is everyone is functioning according to their genes and up to date, and everyone, each of us, are instruments through which life is happening in order for life to unfold exactly as it's destined to unfold. So someone would say, well, that's very convenient. You stole something, and now you're telling me if you steal something, that's God's will. I'm saying, well, that's just my description. I'm not using it as an excuse in stealing it, because that putting forward that excuse or that reasoning, which is not meant to be an excuse, doesn't absolve me from consequence. Where it does help is that if I deeply understand this to be the case, I will have to suffer the consequences. And society generally punishes us for those actions that deliver pain to society, and rewards us for those actions that delivers pleasure to society. So even with the deeply ingrained belief of personal doership, I'm still going to receive the consequence. But attitudinally, I know that God, if there is a God, is not going to hold me personally responsible. So society will punish me or reward me. God, not interested. He's not interested in that. She's not interested in that. It is not interested. Actually, let's forget about God. Let's use God as the source, whatever it is. Source has turned into the manifestation. And we are part of the manifestation, so we are an expression of source. So source is hardly going to punish the expression of source for what happened, except in the form of consequence from society, which is also source. And if I understand this deeply, then the guilt and shame, that is the uncomfortableness, which is always one's attitude to the circumstance, won't arise. Now, guilt and shame is very different to recognizing that that wasn't an optimal way of performing, way of behaving, because of, who got hurt or what the consequence was. So no guilt and no shame doesn't mean that I'm burying my head in the sand and trying to say that it was a great result or that my action can't be improved. What it is saying is, in that moment, because it happened, it couldn't have happened differently. And so I'm not going to beat myself up about it, but I will appreciate that it wasn't optimal, which is part of the learning. And it also doesn't prevent someone feeling remorseful and apologizing to the other. So remorseful simply means I recognize that the actions that happened through me, which in practical terms, on a certain level, I have to accept as my actions, although understanding it's a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning that I had no control over. So on one level, seeing, yes, the actions that happened through me delivered pain to the other. And so there's no reason, in fact, there's still plenty of reason, much more reason than not to apologize. I'm sorry for my actions that hurt you. It wasn't my intention to hurt you. So the benefit is simply the benefit that means the uncomfortableness of blame and hatred towards the other for those actions that they may have delivered that were painful. So the guilt and blame towards the other can fall away. The shame and guilt towards one's actions in the past that delivered painful outcomes to oneself or to someone you cared about or a stranger can fall away. And expectation in the future can fall away because we understand it will unfold one way, and my worrying about it, so worry also and anxiety can fall away because we understand there's no point worrying about it, and there's no point setting up elaborate expectations because life is unlikely to match our expectations. We can point in a certain direction and say, my intention is to go there, however, without an attachment to the outcome. Understanding I want to go there because that if that outcome happens, it will be pleasurable, or I suspect it will be pleasurable, and there's no reason not to move towards pleasure. In fact, the body is always going to move towards its biological preferences and away from its biological non-preferences. So biologically, the body will move towards preferences. So if it can calculate what it thinks may deliver the preference, that will be its intention. However, if the belief in personal doership and attachment has dissolved, then attachment to your preference being delivered will fall away, which means you move in that direction, you work for it with the understanding that the outcome is not in your control. So it might be clear that if life brings about this change, a change from having the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome, which leads to guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation, if that attitude changes, which is not your doing, but a result of new conditioning coming in, so satsang is just new conditioning, that becomes part of your up-to-date conditioning, and there's no telling how radically one can change from some fairly simple new conditioning. So satsang is just new conditioning that can change your up-to-date conditioning, sometimes quite radically. And so if that happens and the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome falls away, that identity falls away, then what we find ourselves is free from suffering, free from the guilt, the blame, the pride, which is all based on, look at what I did Look how good I am, pride. I see what I did and look at the pain it caused me and the people around me. I hate myself. That's shame. Look at what you did. You hurt me. I hate you. That's blame. So all of that, all of those three, guilt, blame, and pride, based on the belief in personal doership. And then that extends further because of the doership. We believe that I am the one that will make outcomes happen. And there is this belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes. And so we end up having worry and anxiety towards the future, and expectation and attachment, which becomes a narrative that prevents us from really being present, because we're always thinking about what is next and what will finally deliver something that we need, and strategizing, and that becomes a non-stop narrative, and of course regret in the past. So all of this thinking, which is what we can call the thinking mind, is a result of the genes and up-to-date conditioning that include in it, if it's destiny, which is how we tend to develop, this deeply ingrained belief that I am the doer. And the dissolving of that means the end of suffering, the end of those narratives that translate to an uncomfortableness with oneself and an uncomfortableness with the other. The end of that narrative, simply because one can't see the other as the doer. One can't see oneself as the doer. And as that stops, we start to experience there is a peace that is available, that is our happiness, and then our insistence that our happiness is to be found in outcomes doesn't make sense anymore. We realize that's where we were heading for most of our life, thinking that our happiness is to be found in outcomes. And at some point, we realized, I've been doing this for long enough. I get the pleasures that I have been aiming for from time to time. And when I get them, they don't offer some magical, ongoing happiness. What they do is they deliver a short-term pleasure, which is very nice. No reason to enjoy it if it's delivered. But to mistake it for happiness means that we are investing our attention in a way that we might not even understand how much attention we're putting into something, because we believe that's where our happiness is to be found. So, if there are any questions, now's the time to ask. Hi, Martin. You've got to unmute yourself, Martin. I don't think we can do it.
Hello, Roger.
Hello.
Hi. Great to see you. Great to hear you. Thanks again for the lovely satsangs. I've been having a question for quite a while, and I'm glad I can ask it. Mm-hmm. So the thing is, I totally go along with the principle of non-doership. And as you explained it today, it is about outer consequences because of a choice I obviously don't do because of my genes and up-to-date conditioning. You told us about this man a son who sees his father in a job he struggles in, and he says, I want to study because I don't want to end up like my father. And I totally get that. But I have a hypothesis that I would like to discuss with you. That kind of, I have the feeling that it shows that there is a small part of doership, and I would like to untangle that with you. Let's say God talks to me and says, you can choose a number between 10 and 100, and it doesn't matter which number you choose, there will be no consequence apart from you have chosen a number. So if you choose 33, or 55 or 7. No, 7 isn't, or let's say between 1 and 100, or 7 and or 99, it doesn't matter. And let's say on Monday, I choose, it's always at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Yeah. So on Monday, I choose a 12. On Tuesday, I choose a 32. And each time there is no consequence, none so ever, obviously different to the one that we talked about with the son and the father. Where does that have a part in the teaching? Because if I'm able to choose, if God tells me there is no consequence, and I could have chosen on Monday instead of 12, I could have chosen 33, then obviously I chose 12 because I like, okay, well, if I say I like 12 on Monday, it's because my team's up-to-date conditioning. Is where am I wrong? Because I'm sure that that you're right about it all, but I just haven't got it. Can you help me?
Well, yes, it seems like there must be a blind spot. I guess that's what you're asking for. But the fact that there's no consequence is inconsequential, because what we're talking about is what makes you pick one of the options. So your option is 98 numbers, unless 1 and 100 are also included. But depends on how you interpret between 1 and 100. So you have either 100 or 98 options, and you have to pick one, and there's no consequence. So the picking of one is a result of the person in that moment, given the circumstance. And the circumstance is God at 3 o'clock on Wednesday asks you to pick and says there's no consequence. And so a number appears in your mind, which is a consequence. The number is a consequence or a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning and the circumstance you find yourself in. So 12 is the first number that you pick. So my description is 12 was picked as a result of Martin's genes and up-to-date conditioning. So what about, which meant the home you were born in or brought up in, the school you went to, and the fact that God appeared and said, pick a number. All of it, everything that came before, is part of your up-to-date conditioning. And that mixed with your genes means Martin is only one way at that point in time.
But I can't see why 12 was chosen instead of 33.
Pardon me?
I can't see why 12 was chosen instead of 33. Is it because there is a hidden, it's not meant in a negative way, but a hidden reason for me choosing 12 and I don't know about it?
No, because your choices are not. The fact that there is no consequence is essentially the consequence. If there was a consequence, you may have picked different to 12. Because there is no consequence, then 12 seems to be the number. So the reason is that Martin wasn't different and the circumstance wasn't different. If Martin was different or the circumstance was different, 12 may not have been the number picked.
Yeah, and that's the thing I'm not getting, because if it's inconsequential and it doesn't matter if I choose 12 or 13, but I choose 12, there must be a reason for me choosing 12.
So the reason is your genes and up-to-date conditioning, but you may not be able to think about the reason now.
Okay,
but that doesn't mean there isn't a reason.
For example, I think that 1 and 2 is nice to look at instead of 1 and 4, something like that. It could be.
Yeah, of course.
Right.
I mean, if we take it in a more rudimentary manner, I could say, well, what's your next thought going to be, right? And
mm,
the answer to that is, I don't know, you probably, and that was your next thought.
mm-hmm,
And so the thing is that we don't really know whenever we make any decision, it just pops into your mind, whatever it is, the
mm,
thought, the decision. And so we can also say, well, 12 popped into your mind. And it's as simple as that. That's because that's the mechanics, really, is thoughts just pop into your mind. I don't argue with the fact that if someone said, well, they popped into my mind, but because of my brain functioning a certain way, I'm happy with that. But
mm,
all we know really in each moment is what eventuates.
mm,
So 12 in that day is what eventuated.
mm-hmm. Yeah, but it kind of makes it hard for me um, to um, to see the depth of it all because it really seems inconsequential to me. So if I had chosen 14 on that day, of it could have been because of my genes and up-to-date conditioning, but it could also have been because I'm the doer who says today, because it's inconsequential, I'm going to choose this number. Can you see what I mean? It's very subtle, but it's like, yeah, of course, it sounds a bit like a cop out, to say, well, it was your genes and up-to-date conditioning. But I could also
Yeah.
argue that it was me who said, today it's going to be 15 because I wanted it, not because it was given to me by life. But there must be a wrong thinking about this. I have the
Well,
gut
yeah,
feeling.
because it's um, you can say. I mean, that's what I'm saying is that this, the human condition is to say this was me, not and not because life made me pick that, right?
Mm,
That's the human condition of doership, of personal doership, is exactly that. And so you can say that. So someone can say, "Well, I picked this because I wanted to." That's what you're saying, right?
yes, but the thing is, the example with the orange juice. If I pick from a menu and there's apple juice, orange juice, and blackcurrant juice, and I know that I like orange juice, it's easy to say, well, it's because of my genes and up-to-date conditioning, or rather because of my genes, because I don't like apple juice or blackcurrant juice. But if I
Hmm.
choose something that is totally inconsequential, like even I couldn't say that 15 is nicer to me than 34, then there is not the link towards it's my genes doesn't apply anymore.
It does, but you can't see how it applies. But
Yeah,
it
okay.
does.
Well,
So I'm trying to I'm now what we're trying to do is narrow that gap.
yeah.
So what if I bring in the answer? This as the thing. So God tells you it's inconsequential, right? And so
Hmm.
you go, I'm not going to pick a number then, right? That is valid, right?
Yeah.
Because and so then if you say, well, I'm not going to pick a number then, that response is a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning.
Hmm.
That's fair, right?
Yeah.
So by default, if you pick a number, given that you had the option to say, well, I'm not going to pick a number, God will say, why are you not going to pick a number? And you say, well, you said it was inconsequential.
Hmm.
So why would I pick a number if it's inconsequential? So that rationale, I think God will, um, uh, you've got an argument there. He might then say, well, there'll be a consequence if you don't pick a number, and then you might say, will it be a good consequence or a bad consequence?
Mm.
So you can see that your gene up-to-date conditioning can take you down a path of saying, well, I don't want to do it then. And if you don't go down that path and you pick a number, then that must be because of your genes and up-to-date conditioning. Because if you had different genes and up-to-date conditioning, you might challenge God. And if you had different genes and up-to-date conditioning, you might pick 53. But because you have specific genes and up-to-date conditioning that, let's say, make you pick 12, then you pick 12. I think the confusion is when you think that it's only got to do with consequence that will mean it's because of genes and up-to-date conditioning. Whereas the concept being put forward is saying everything, the very fact that you are conscious, or well, the very fact that you think anything, including a number, has no other reason other than genes and up-to-date conditioning. So without genes and up-to-date conditioning, you can't possibly think of a number. If we took genes and up-to-date conditioning away, Martin would disappear. There is nothing of Martin as far as the biological or psychological movement that isn't genes and up-to-date conditioning. And so the very act of thinking, if thinking happened, is genes and up-to-date conditioning.
Yeah, but I think this is something that I can just hope that grace will give me, that I'm completely convinced in a good way to say, okay, it's totally up to genes and up-to-date conditioning, because I have the feeling as long as I can see no real reason for 12 or 53 or 98 popping up, then I really have the feeling I can choose, because there is no reason for it to turning up.
Who's the I? Who when you say I can choose, who's choosing?
Well, the feeling is, I know, I know the answer is supposed to be it's not me, because, or it's a psychological construct. But I wanted to create a case where I could say, well, it must have been my psychological construct that doesn't exist, in at least for this small moment, because it is unreasonable, or it doesn't matter if I choose 12 or 53. But if there is a hidden reason, because life says in this moment Martin is supposed to think 34, then I can't see it. And that makes it really difficult for me to say, because all the other examples you've given, they're totally clear to me, because they're obviously linked to my genes and up-to-date conditioning. And I don't mean, I see that being able to think of numbers is, of course, something that I was told at school, so that I know a number like 12, or that I can see it in my mind. But that's not what I mean. I mean that the act of choosing a number in itself, it's kind of it's a super layer on the teaching itself. And I don't want to be devil's advocate, because I think it's boring to be devil's advocate. But
no, I can see where the misunderstanding is, because genes and up-to-date conditioning are not only talking about decisions that you make or choices that you make. It's talking about the very fact that there is a body there functioning. So if you took away genes and up-to-date conditioning, so let's assume, does God have to come and talk to Martin's body? Is that how God delivers the message to you?
yeah. Okay, well, it doesn't matter. It could also be like a voice from the heavens. I don't know. That's
but what is receiving the instruction?
but that's just the construct for the case.
Yeah. So but there's a reason for me asking, because
Okay, yeah, I
what
know.
I'm saying is that genes and up-to-date conditioning means the ears, the face, the arms, the legs, the torso, the brain, the conceptualizing capacity. All of that is genes and up-to-date conditioning. So if we took genes and up-to-date conditioning away, there simply wouldn't be an entity for God to speak to.
Mm.
So that's why we can't. That's why you can't ever get past, as is presented in this framework, the fact that whatever happens is a result of your genes up-to-date conditioning. Because frankly, there are only genes and up-to-date conditioning and nothing else.
Mm.
So, somewhere in your thinking, from what I'm hearing, there is the assumption that the one making the decision that could be argued to be me is independent of genes and up-to-date conditioning. And the point I'm trying to make here is that the genes and up-to-date conditioning are what have turned into the form Martin as a thinking organism. So if you take genes and up-to-date conditioning away, there's no Martin to play the game of picking a number.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I thank you for the question, because it what it's done, and if I can think about after this, if I can think about a better way to answer it, I will. I'll get back to you, because what your question has done, you're sort of like a guinea pig in a way in a lab for me. So
Yeah.
I get to see your thinking process reflected in the question.
Yeah.
And what you've put forward here is quite unique in a way, as far as I hadn't thought about that misunderstanding or confusion happening in the way that I can see it. I might not have addressed it properly, but if I think of a good way of addressing it, I'll come back to you.
That's wonderful. Just one afterthought. I think what you've been on to as far as the hidden reason is concerned, I think that's really, really important, because let's say, because I've been thinking about this myself, let's say on Monday, I choose 55 and there seems to be no reason for me. But if I dig deeper, it could be that I like the double numbers, for example, better than other numbers that are not double digits. Because
Well, saying the
sorry?
reason I'm saying the reason is that you're there in the first place.
Yeah.
But so even what you're looking at reason is secondary or tertiary. The primary reason that you thought of the number is that you exist, and you exist because of a result of genes and up-to-date conditioning. So the reason is the genes and up-to-date conditioning, and I think you're looking at genes as up-to-date conditioning as a control panel for secondary.
Yeah, totally. I totally do. I know that. I know that. I know that. And there seems to be a case where I could say, okay, I get that with the genes and up-to-date conditioning, but inside the theory, there is a kind of wiggle room. And I don't want that wiggle room, because as long as I have it, I won't have peace of mind, you know?
Yes. So go back a step, which is Martin comes into existence when the sperm and egg come together. And that is the genetic code in place, right? And so that's the gene part. So Martin being in the world is a result of the genes. And then Martin being the genetic part, the hardware, being programmed a certain way is the result of the conditioning. So to me, the very fact that there is a Martin to play the game and understands language and all of that is a result of genes and up-to-date conditioning. So if you
Yeah.
go back there, then there's no wiggle room whatsoever.
Yeah,
So
you're right. I just had a feeling that wasn't intellectual, where I could see that my whole construct in itself is invalid because of that. Yeah. So
all
case
right,
closed, I hope, at least. Thank you very much.
give it
I'll be
some more
thinking
thought.
about it, and I'll get back to you if there is still something I come up with. But if you include it in the teachings, because that's been really nagging at me. but it is a faulty thinking, forgetting about totally forgetting about genes and up-to-date conditioning. It's like I'm the one who created myself, and now I'm able to choose a number, which is obviously wrong.
Yeah, so that's why the alternative is we just say everything is happening according to God's will. So 52, 55, 12, 8, that was all God's will.
Yeah.
So God asked you to pick a number, and the number you picked was God's will.
Yeah. Thank you, Roger.
Hi, Martin. Martin, number 2.
Hi, Roger. I think you could be able to hear me now.
Yes, I can.
I just think it's very interesting what you do. It's not a question, that's a statement, isn't it? But yeah, when I heard you say, Martin, unmute, I sort of thought, my God, I put my hand up. Why is he asking me? I then my glasses, and then there's another Martin. It never occurred to me that there could have been another Martin. How extraordinary. But I think I just think you're just so patient. I think it's just amazing that you sit there with such patience. But I still can't understand. What I can't understand is what the other Martin was thinking he was doing. That God's asking him to think of a number at a particular time of the day. For me, that's just a belief in I am the doer, and I'm attached to an outcome. If I choose a number, if it's that particular number, there must be a consequence, when surely the outcome could be there is no consequence. Nothing ever happened.
Well, I think it was a thought experiment, more so than anything. So we have to. There is some validity in if you have a thought experiment, and you're
Sure.
trying to find a whole. Yeah, but
Yeah,
let's.
you're
have
the
you,
expert. Yeah, I think you can just sit around and tie yourself up in knots all day, and what's the point? But the question I was going to ask you was, can you?
be a good one.
Will be, yeah. Is this about consequence and outcomes? Perhaps I can explain. I thought for quite some considerable time that all the trauma I suffered before I was born, and when I was born as a child, as a teenager, obviously traumatized me. And then later in life, when I did find complete happiness and fulfillment, as a result of those traumas, I then lost everything that I had gained, if you know what I mean. And I used to think, well, it just seems so unfair that someone could have suffered all that, then found what they needed and wanted and happiness in life. And then as a result of that, because of my behaviors, my genes and up-to-date conditioning, I behaved in such ways that all those things left my life. Including, my wife one day was sat at the dressing table and she said to me, do you know what, Mark, I want to split. And, it came as a complete surprise to me. And that's what happened. And everything fell apart. So I can now see that everything unfolded exactly as it was always destined to unfold.
Mm-hmm.
But what is the difference between an outcome and a consequence, or are they the same thing?
They're the same thing. All consequences are outcomes.
Yes.
So even the word circumstance equates to outcomes. They're not exactly the same, but essentially all circumstance is either pleasure or pain. Outcomes are pleasure or pain. The flow of life, you can say, is a ongoing sequence of outcomes or an ongoing sequence of circumstance. Clearly, you can be more specific and say there are outcomes within circumstance. But really, if you break a circumstance down, there's a whole, it's a continual movement of cause and effect, and an effect becomes the next cause for the next effect, which becomes the cause for the next effect. So you could say that each cause that has an effect, the effect is the outcome. So essentially, the flow of life is either pleasure or pain, and flow of life refers to circumstance or outcomes. So, yeah, good we clarified this. Someone else asked this last week, so it needs clarification.
Thanks, Roger. Very interesting, always. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Martin. That's it seems. Well, that's it for now.